Welcome to another weekend bonus episode of the Tech Meme Ride Home. I'm Brian McCullough, as always. We're actually going to talk to somebody that has been on our show, I think 3 or 4 times now. So an old friend of the pod, as folks like to say. Chris Dixon, how are you doing, sir?
Good, Brian. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, this is an exciting time to have you back on because your first book is out. Read, Write, Own, Building the Next Era of the Internet. Congratulations on writing a book.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very excited.
You and I have a connection now because when my book came out, you were the interviewer when I came on the a16z's podcast. So
I love your book. I recommend it often.
Thank you so much.
I think it's the best. It's a shockingly accurate, as somebody who was experienced much of that history of the internet. You were very accurate, and your business analysis was right on. And so, and I feel like it really filled a gap. There wasn't a book that kind of did it from that perspective. So I think it's a great book.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was the idea, but this is about yours, and this is about me turning the tables on you right now. So,
okay, great, thanks.
Read, Write, Own. There's a couple different theses that are right in the title, and again, if people have heard Chris and I talk before, this has been something that we've discussed before, sort of the different eras of the internet. And so, like, implicit in that title is, the Web 1.0 era was read. You go see content produced by others, go to websites and things like that. The Write era was sort of Web 2.0 and sort of the social media era, which, is still going strong today. And so the third era is Own. What will happen when we get to Own?
Yeah. And so as you said, I've been working on the internet for 25 years now and got involved in the internet because I was excited by kind of the promise of the 90s internet of being of this open, permissionless, decentralized network where anyone, an artist, an entrepreneur, just a creative person could go and put up a website and be sort of an equal participant in the network. And and as you said, the internet's gone through multiple eras. One of my kind of great concerns is that the internet has gotten increasingly consolidated, and that there are essentially 4 or 5 companies that control the vast majority of the services that we use on a daily basis, and that gives them immense power to control both your access to these services, how your data is used, and how, very importantly, how the money flows around the internet and who gets that money, all of the kind of money spent on advertising and purchases and everything else. And so the book is about sort of, as you said, read and write. These are I think kind of widely acknowledged sort of 2 eras of the internet. In fact, you mentioned the Web 2 era in the 2000s. A lot of people actually at the time call it the read write era. The book is about what I hope will be the 3rd era of the internet, the Own era, which would be an era built around new technologies, specifically blockchain technologies, that allow us to build a new wave of internet services that return us to the architecture and a lot of the ideals of the 90s internet, that return power to the edges of the network, to users, creators, entrepreneurs. And I go through in the book in kind of great detail. I'd spoken on this topic. I've spoken on it for years. Talked about blockchains and new kind of internet architectures, new services like this, but found that it was always hard to explain it in an hour because it required all this historical context and all these other kinds of this background information. And so finally decided I needed to write a book, and that's what it is. So it really kind of goes through in detail, goes through the history, as you described it, the kind of the read era and the write era, and the kind of the particularly important points there. I try to weave in stories from my own experience and from research. And then I go through in detail and talk about how we can build new services using blockchains that give us a lot of societal benefits that we sought in the original internet. I also, one of the important part of the book is a lot of people think of blockchains and tokens as being these speculative assets, and they think about FTX and all of the other, Bitcoin and all the kind of trading and speculative behavior. I talk about this a lot in the book. I think of it as there's really 2 cultures around this movement. There's what I call the casino in the computer. The casino is this speculative culture. And I agree with the critics that say this has led to a lot of negative outcomes. I think there's this other side to the coin. There's this very positive way to use blockchains, and that's what I try to really spell out in detail in the book. I think that, you know, another topic I touch on is that we need to, as a society, from a policy point of view, where we put our energy, where we put our money, do things to mitigate the negative effects, but encourage the positive use cases. And so that's another major theme of the book.
I want to obviously come to all of that, but
Yeah.
let me come back to own
Mhm.
to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about recently. I mean, the
Sure.
idea of the creator economy is not new.
No.
Has been very big for, you know, more than half a decade now, but it's becoming increasingly, I think, the way that people experience the internet first, in terms of
Mhm.
that is their primary, when they go on the internet, they're creating now, like, you know, CapCut being the top of the App Store for all
Mhm.
of 2023 and things like that shows you that more and more people, it's not new that people are sharing on the internet,
Yeah.
but they're sharing in a way now where it's like it might be important for them to own their content, to own
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
it's distributed, to own the ways that it's produced and distributed and things like that. So how does your vision for sort of Web3 play into,
Yeah.
if we're all going to be tiny little experts in this niche or that topic or this topic, and that is part of, it's not just having an identity on the internet, it's having a
Yeah.
brand or
Mhm.
having a voice. How does Web3 play
Yeah.
into that? Because that
Well,
to me sounds like owning.
yeah, so it's exactly. So look, I think to your point, more and more sort of the line between, you know, in the old days we had this idea of like you're a professional creator and you're not, someone else is not. I think that line has been increasingly blurred, and that will continue over time, right? So everybody in some sense will be is an influencer to some degree, and I think more and more people will earn a living that way. Today, when you go and sign up for a service like TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, you don't own anything, right? You don't own your name. And in fact, I go through the book. There's been many cases where people have literally had their handle taken away from them for capricious reasons. You more subtle and more common is your reach is algorithmically determined and is often dialed back. You'll hear this a lot from creators, you know, influencers on places like TikTok and other places where they'll build up an audience. Maybe they'll get, let's just say, millions of followers, and then one day suddenly they'll get less and less engagement, and that's because there's a deliberate strategy within these companies, as there should be, by the way, for profit maximizing social networks, which is they want to turn the dials and do other things such that people have to essentially pay to, you know, that they can increase their advertising reach, that they aren't too dependent on a few suppliers, right? They don't want YouTube doesn't want to have 5 people that produce 70% of the content, right? They want a really wide range of people. And in fact, TikTok, for example, has very deliberately lately been doing this, where they had a bunch of people with 300 million followers, and they've had an active program internally to diversify that kind of quote unquote supplier content, right? And so you're completely at the whim, not only for your very existence on these networks, but also, I think, much more subtly and more impactfully for your reach and your ability to make a living. By the way, it's almost all of these networks outside of YouTube. YouTube's the one exception. Don't share any of the revenue with their creators. They have these like little creator funds, which are sub 1% of their revenue, and of that, outside of YouTube paying out 20 billion, the rest kept basically, you know, 99% of that money for themselves. Which, what that also means is that these influencers are forced to kind of go through these gymnastics to make money. So you speak to an influencer on TikTok, and they're off selling, you know, things, merchandising in Walmart, or they're trying to get sponsorships because they can't make money directly on the platform. So contrast that with email, which is a Web 1, right? It's sort of a holdover, a leftover from the Web 1 era. If you have an email audience, you can do whatever you want with that audience. You don't pay a middleman for that ability. You can sell them products, you can run advertising, and whatever you make, you keep. I mean, you may pay a credit card company 3% or something, but with TikTok, you're paying all the money to the platform, right? And so that's how the Web 1 platform. So the Web 1 protocols, platforms that still exist today, right, are the World Wide Web. So if you have a website, a domain name, and you control that. You have a direct relationship with your audience. With email, you have a direct relationship with your audience. And with these Web2 networks, although they did a lot of good things for the world, in the end, they're very, very extractive. They're very controlling. They're very extractive. And all trends point to that becoming even more so. Go look at your Google search results today. It's very, very different than your search results 10 years ago, in the sense that you now get mostly either Google content, they're promoting their own content, or sponsored content, right? 10 years ago, it was all these kind of nice organic links. And that has all sorts of that. I think it's a negative effect on the user. I think those are worse results. I think it's almost, my personal view, I don't even use Google anymore. I think it's just gotten terrible. And I think it's going to continue, by the way, because all the kind of corporate incentives will just continue. They need to layer on, sort of the whole thing is around, can we grow profits, revenues 20% year over year? And the only way to really do that right now at their scale is to keep kind of squeezing more juice out. But on the flip side, if you're building if you have a website or you're building an e-commerce business, that the effect is, instead of getting X% of your traffic for free organic links, more and more of that's coming through sponsored. So it's a way of squeezing both sides. Both the user gets squeezed and having a worse experience, having more data extracted, et cetera. But then on the supply side, so to speak, the entrepreneur side, which is, of course, in my job, I invest in entrepreneurs. I interact with those. I see it from that side. They're all getting squeezed as well. Look at Amazon. Amazon now, when I use Amazon, I think they have a great product. But I now, by default, scroll down 2/3 of the way every page, because they're layering more and more sponsored links on. It's fine for me. I can scroll down. What it's not fine for are all the businesses that have built a living on Amazon, who now are getting far fewer clicks, or they have to pay more to get kind of, listed higher in the page, because of course Amazon knows that the higher ones in the page get clicked on more. And so you basically have a situation where, and then layer on AI. AI is awesome. It's an amazing technology. I'm very excited about it. But the reality is it is a technology that favors large incumbents with big stores of data and capital and compute. And so I think AI, for all of its benefits, will further accelerate this. And I think we're very close to ending up with an internet that's sort of like the old broadcast TV of like ABC, CBS, and NBC, and they control everything, and they make all the money, and we lose everything that's wonderful and I think was originally beautiful about the internet, and why I spent my career on the internet. I fell in love with that vision, that early vision of a open, decentralized network, and I think we are at serious risk of losing that. And so, and what I write about in the book is this idea that what I think a blockchain is essentially is a new building material for building networks, that have, as I describe it, the societal benefits of the early Web 1 networks, but a lot of the competitive advantages, advanced functionality, and other kinds of things that we expect from modern internet services. So let you create and I think of it as sort of the best of both worlds of having advanced features and functionality, but also the kind of open, decentralized aspects of the early kind of Web 1 protocols. And
let's we've done 3 examples. So like the users as increasingly creators, higher powered creators than even 10 years ago. You mentioned e-commerce and selling on top of platforms. We didn't even mention things like startups and app developers and things like that.
Well, developers, developers, as you know from being a historian, there was this sort of developer apocalypse of 2011 to 12. So what happened, just for folks who don't know, is essentially social networks kind of came along in the 2000s. It was the belief in the startup community that these were the new platforms, in the sense of like the way operating systems were in let's say the 80s, 90s. And so there was a huge wave of startups building on Twitter and Facebook and other platforms like this. And the understanding was these platforms, similar to the web and email, would remain relatively, even though they were run by companies, they would remain relatively open. And so for example, Twitter didn't have their own client, their own app that you could download for the first, I believe it was 5 years, and they just relied on third parties. So there was Tweety and Twiddlator and like 50 others that you would just download. And the idea, and same with email, like there's no email app, right? You use Gmail or you download Outlook. Like email is just this sort of protocol that exists in the cloud. and there are other clients for it. And that was the attitude that Twitter, as an example, had. And then it was around 2011 and 12. And I think, by the way, there's deep reasons why it was around that time. And I go through that in the book, but I won't go into detail now. But essentially, all of these large social network platforms started to change their policies and became much, much more restrictive. And, Twitter bought one of the apps, and then shut down effectively shut down their API. And they all went sort of siloed. Fast forward today, it's even today on X, Twitter, even having a link in your tweet will severely decrease, supposedly will seriously decrease the reach of that tweet. This is happening more. It's getting so, these platforms are becoming so siloed now that even linking out is a punished behavior. And that they really just want you to live and spend all of your time in one of these 4 or 5 silos.
Well, and it's almost like
yeah.
that's antithetical to the creation, because it's like they just want you to be consuming. It's like we're almost coming back to the television model of things, where obviously they need the cheap content.
Yeah, well, they want you to create enough content that they don't have to pay for the content,
but don't get too successful. Right, exactly.
Yeah. But they basically, what they want is sort of 10 million worker bees creating their content for them without paying for it. But not like 10 really powerful worker bees who would actually have the power to start negotiating and,
they want long tail, but not stars.
That's
stars
right. That's right.
So,
that's
okay.
Right.
Given those 3 examples, and we're talking about blockchain as being a solution to that. So either if you have an overarching, but I'm looking for a tangible way that blockchain is a solution for a person creating a person selling a startup trying to gain traction. Like,
well, I'll give you an example. So like music's an interesting example where so today, most music will go through platforms like Spotify. Spotify's own stats, I think they say they have 8 million artists on the platform. And of that, I believe the number is 14,000 make $50,000 a year or more. So a very, very small percentage make sort of the average American salary. And if you just, for folks listening, if you ask your musician friends if they make money on streaming, they'll basically say no. And that's because the labels take money, but also the platforms take money. And basically all these different people take money along the way, and the musicians end up with very little. So you can use blockchains, for example. There's a bunch of projects that sell tickets and digital collectibles and art directly to their audience using blockchains, using NFTs, using other kinds of tokens, as just one example. And so even though now everyone's saying NFTs are dead, this year when NFTs are quote dead, there'll be about $2 billion with a B of sales of NFTs, of creative people selling NFTs to creators, which is like I mentioned, because these Web2 platforms basically don't pay out, is already a really meaningful number. But the key point there is you're selling direct, right? Anything you sell, if you sell a ticket or merchandise or whatever you're selling via a blockchain, there is no intermediary. A blockchain is one way to think of a blockchain. It's a way to create digital services with no intermediary, right? And so you can create, there are also very interesting examples where people are building social networks. People are building a collaborative, I have a chapter in this, the book, what I call collaborative storytelling. So people coming together and creating narrative worlds together, and they get rewarded with tokens in proportion to their contribution to those stories. People are creating video games where they're kind of community-owned video games with no company behind them. And the digital goods, which have been a model in video games for years, video games will sell about 60 billion with a B dollars worth of virtual goods this year. It's 3 times bigger than the music industry. It's just simply the video game digital goods industry. And people are now doing that without, but today there's done through a company like Epic. Fortnite sells those and is the intermediary and takes most of the money. So people are building a new wave of games where you're just essentially removing those companies, and the money is going directly peer to peer. So one user creates something, the other user gets that. These are just a couple examples where, but basically what's happening, and the way I see it is, and the reason I think it's a full new era of the web is this isn't going to happen overnight. Like, you need to go and build out new services, and these are new services that have new architectures, right? And that's what the entrepreneurs that I work with as an investor are trying to build out. And what I'm trying to do in the book is explain what they're doing, because I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding around it, exacerbated by a lot of the things I mentioned earlier, FTX, speculation culture, et cetera. And so that's created all sorts of confusion. And that's what I'm trying to clear up in the book is, hey, there's this other vision, this is productive vision of these things. It's not about gambling.
I'm going to let you do that real quick, but I don't
Yeah.
know if I've ever said this on the show, but one of my formative gaming experiences was on the Prodigy bulletin boards, where I got involved in Star Trek role playing games where, we're messaging back and forth doing role playing. So to use your example of gaming there, like imagine a situation where everyone's say subscribing to participate in a given game, and the more you participate or whatever, like I became a captain of a ship. We wrote a
Yeah.
whole constitution
Yeah.
for our but imagine that we are we're playing the game and we're also owners of the game, and owners in
Yeah.
relation to how much we're participating in the game and
That's
things
right.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, you mentioned space games. EVE Online is a very famous space game, which it's been around about 20 years. It pioneered a lot of these kind of virtual world ideas. Many millions of people have these space battles. One of our portfolio companies, EVE Online, is EVE Online. They've done a spin out where they're creating exactly kind of what you're describing. It's like a space world where all of the, it's all created by the community, and it's a fully kind of peer-to-peer world. And it's built using blockchains, and that's exactly the kind of thing you can do.
So let me give you the opportunity to do what you've tried to do a couple times now. Explain to me the
Yeah,
distinction in your mind between crypto and Web3 in the sense that both are using
yeah,
blockchain, but there's different underlying assumptions to how and
yeah.
why.
Well, I'd kind of compare it to something like think about real estate in the real world, right? So you have real estate, and a key aspect of real estate is that you can own a house, that there's ownership, right? And I think we all realize that why that's valuable, right? You can own a house. It's important for a couple. Like, why do I want to own my house instead of renting my house? One is financial. Like, once I own it, hopefully it will appreciate over time, and that can be a source of personal wealth. But it's also psychological, right? Just satisfaction knowing you own the home and you can live there with your family. And then it's also an incentive. It's an incentive question. The fact that I own it gives me an incentive to improve it. There's lots of studies that show that people that own things improve them and contribute more to the community, right? I have an incentive to build not just my home, but my community. As a byproduct of real estate ownership, we have speculation, real estate speculation, right? So you have people flipping houses, and there's all these reality TV shows about it. I don't really watch them. There's hedge funds involved in it. There's a whole REIT market, and there was all the stuff that happened in 2008. And so there's speculation is a buy. Any market where you have ownership, you have speculation, right? But I think in a healthy market, the ownership for kind of incentive, psychological, personal kind of wealth appreciation, all of those kind of good things come first. And the speculation is this byproduct that happens. And look, it plays a role, by the way. Like, people generally don't like speculators, but the reality is they provide liquidity. They make it so it's, you have good price discovery. There is a kind of a role, but again, it's about proportionality, right? It should be a relatively small aspect of the whole real estate market and all the activity. I think so blockchains, one of the cool things you can do with blockchains is you can create tokens, and tokens I think of as the atomic unit of ownership. A token is kind of the encapsulation of ownership. And so if I can own a piece of Bitcoin by owning a Bitcoin. I can own a digital collectible by owning NFT, or a video game good by owning NFT, right? But the actual mechanism by which you own it is a token. Now, there are people that take those tokens and take them out of their proper context. Like, they take that virtual good that we were describing, that spaceship, out of a video game, and they make a website like FTX or something, and they start saying, hey, you can bet on the price of spaceships, right? And then that ends up getting what's basically happened over the last, like, especially 2021, 22, is that happened a lot. People took these things that had a certain intended use, took them out of context, marketed and hyped them up. And that created this public image of what blockchains are for, and also created a regulatory and policy kind of backlash. And so I'm not saying that stuff doesn't exist. It does exist. And I actually, I believe very strongly that we need regulation to tamp that down. But I also am trying to make the point in the book to let's not allow that to let us lose sight of the primary goal. Like, home ownership is still valuable, even though there's a real estate bubble, right?
Yeah.
And we need to kind of come back to that and understand that. And I think a smart policy approach would be one where we look at the technology holistically. We say, what are the good things you can do and what are the bad things you can do? You can build a house with a hammer. You can destroy a house. You can destroy something with a hammer, right? There's lots of technologies that can be used for good or bad. And a smart policy approach would be to understand the good and bad, and then to design a policy that maximizes the good and minimizes the bad. And I don't think that's the approach that the US is taking right now. I think instead it's a much more reactive approach. A lot of it's getting settled in messy legal disputes. And so that's another kind of theme of my book is once we understand what the good things are, how can we, as a society, if assuming we choose to embrace those good things, design policy, investment, all other kind of align our efforts around that and make sure that we get the best outcome. And by the way, all the stuff I'm saying, you could say about AI, you could say about VR, about self-driving cars, like these are all, I think, going to be more and more top of mind questions as technology continues to march ahead.
Well, for sure. And, sort of final one, you just mentioned it, is AI. And you go into this in the book that
Mhm.
that the blockchain will have maybe a bigger role to play potentially than a lot of people are thinking
Yeah.
right now
Yeah.
in the AI moment, in terms of things like, again, it comes to ownership and things like, copyright and identity even. But so
Yeah.
give me some views on how you think the blockchain will play in sort of
Yeah.
this AI moment.
And I'll give you one simple example. I mean, so Sam Altman created
Right.
another company besides OpenAI called WorldCoin, which we're
Hmm.
the lead investors in. And the idea there is that in the world of AI, where bots can pass the Turing test, you can't rely on things like CAPTCHAs. If people know those CAPTCHAs, right? The things that pop up that tell you to find all the traffic lights. You have to click on all the traffic, whatever. Those things aren't going to work anymore, right? Like all the mechanisms we've used on the internet to detect if somebody's a person. I mean, you're going to get such sophisticated phishing attacks now. People on Twitter, misinformation. Like it's just like again, I'm pro AI. I think it's mostly good, but it's going to break a lot of the systems that we use today. For example, detect if somebody's human. And so what WorldCoin, Sam Altman's other startup, is doing is creating a new system for basically basically the idea is that everybody would have kind of a cryptographic signature that lets them prove that they're human. And that's something that you use a blockchain for. A blockchain is a great way to store things like cryptographic signatures that prove you're human, or for example, a cryptographic signature that proves this video is real as opposed to being a deep fake. That's a section I have in the book talking about deep fakes, right? So the right way to do kind of deep fake authentication is to have some kind of public record, some auditable public trail, which is exactly what a blockchain is, that says this piece of content was attested to, was signed by the New York Times, signed to this piece of content and said that we attest to it, that we actually, believe it's real video. And there's a public auditable trail of that. That's what a blockchain is perfectly designed for. Another, I think, interesting use case is, I talk about in the book is around, the sort of the business model for content on the internet. And just to give you a little bit of history on that, there's what I call a sort of an implicit covenant today between quote unquote distribution, like Google and social media, and content, meaning if you have a website, you're an artist, you're a news media site. And that covenant essentially, like for example with Google, is if I have a news site, I allow Google to crawl my content and to take snippets of it and put it in their search results in exchange for them sending me traffic back, right? That's sort of how the internet has evolved over 30 years. It's sort of this quid pro quo between content and same with social media. Like you're allowed to, hey, it's okay if Facebook takes a little snippet of my headline as long as they put a link back, right? In an AI world, when you can just go to an AI system and say, give me the 10 best restaurants or something, no longer need to click through and go back and read the original source. It just gives you the answer, right? And so that will, effectively break that covenant, right? Or let's say with art, like, hey, just give me a cool picture that looks like this, and a system like Midjourney that's trained
Yep.
on a bunch of images just gives you the image. You don't need to go to the art. And so, unfortunately, now, of course, the content sites are responding by putting up paywalls. Reddit just deprecated their API. Twitter's done that. I think you're going to see a lot more. I think you see a lot of artists take their content down. I think it's really unfortunate, right? What would be the right outcome? I think the right outcome is to essentially have some kind of a kind of collective bargaining system, a network between content providers and content distributors that
Because there's a chain of provenance, so that wherever it goes, however it gets remixed, whatever it gets put into a new container, there's still, you can trace it back,
you
and
can
then
you can trace it, and you can set terms. Like a blockchain lets you have code and lets you set terms. So I could be an artist and say, I'm going to put my content into this repository. You can, if you want to use it, you here are the terms, and here's how much you pay me. If you want to train your AI system on it, you have to pay me X% of the revenue of your system, or whatever the terms might be. And you can set the terms, right? So it's essentially an engine for doing economic kind of negotiation and term setting. And so that's what a smart contracts are and things. If you've heard these terms, what blockchains have. And so it's another way to think of a blockchain is a collective bargaining system where like a million people. I mean, one of the reasons why do content providers get the short end of the stick against content distributors on the internet? It's because of fragmentation, right? You've got 10 million content providers and you've got 5 to 10 major distributors, right? So if I'm one artist and I decide to opt out, you can opt out, right? You can put like a no robots. Presumably you'll have some way to opt out of training if you don't already, AI training. You can opt out, but you have no leverage if there's 10 million of you. You need a way to get together and collectively bargain. And that's a blockchain is literally a machine, like a software machine decide for this devised to collectively bargain. Like that's one way to look at them. And so they can come together in a system and say, hey, us 10,000 artists are going to get together and we're going to put our art here, and you can train on it, or you can copy it, or you can use it, but you've got to follow all of these terms and pay us this much money, as an example. And so it's a way to design new economic covenants between different participants in the network.
Yes, that to me from day one has been what I thought that the blockchain was going to deliver to us. So even though it's taken a little bit of time,
Yeah,
it's almost like
look,
you need
yeah.
you need the maybe sometimes you need the outside impetus to bring the use case to the forefront that was sort of like theoretical before there was a pressing need.
No, I think AI. I think if we're smart about it, that in a lot of ways the counterbalancing force to AI, the centralizing nature of AI, are blockchains, right? They are the counterweight. I think. I say if we're smart about it, because I think that unfortunately blockchains have now, just become just politicized, and there's just a lot of emotion around it. And so, but I think if you look at it dispassionately, it's a very powerful tool for counteracting a lot of the centralizing effects of AI.
Well, in an effort to do that, to demystify, depoliticize, Chris Dixon's book is Read, Write, Own, Building the Next Era of the Internet, available now. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see the book cover, and you can go order it immediately. Chris, thank you for allowing me to square the circle 6 years later. You interviewed me for my book. I'm interviewing you for your book. It's a fantastic book. I hope everyone gets it.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me.